The bullet whistled past her ear as Nora Campbell ducked behind the water trough, her heart hammering against her ribs like a wild Mustang. The Colorado Territory in 1871 was no place for a woman alone, especially one who hadn't spoken a word in 3 years. The dust settled around her as hooves thundered past, the gang of outlaws who'd targeted the small town of Redemption Creek moving on to wreak havoc elsewhere. She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, willing her breathing to slow. The townspeople would be emerging soon, assessing the damage, counting their losses. Nora wouldn't join them. She never did. Instead, she'd slip away to the small cabin she kept on the outskirts of town, the one place she felt safe since the incident that had stolen her voice and shattered her trust. Preston James watched from the doorway of the mercantile, his eyes following the slender figure of the woman everyone in town called the Silent Widow. Nobody knew her story, not really. She'd arrived in Redemption Creek 3 years ago, purchased supplies with written notes, and kept to herself. Preston had been curious from the start, but unlike the other men in town, he'd never pushed for answers. "She all right?" Hank Morrison, the mercantile owner, stepped up beside Preston, shotgun still in hand from the recent commotion. Preston nodded, watching as Nora gathered her dropped parcels. "Seems so. Wish she'd let someone help her." "That one's got walls higher than the Rocky Mountains," Hank replied. "Heard tell she hasn't spoken a single word since arriving." "Everyone's got their reasons," Preston said quietly, adjusting his worn Stetson. "Doesn't mean they need fixing." As a rancher who'd carved out a modest spread just north of town, Preston understood the value of patience. He'd tamed wild horses that others had given up on, simply by giving them time and space. People weren't so different, he figured, especially those who'd been hurt. Nora felt his gaze from across the street, but didn't look up. She knew who was watching the tall cowboy with kind eyes who always tipped his hat to her, but never insisted on conversation like the others. Over the past year, she'd noticed him more and more. He seemed content to exist in her orbit without demanding anything in return. She gathered the last of her supplies and headed toward her cabin, feeling the weight of unsaid words pressing against her throat like always. Sometimes she wondered if she even remembered how to speak, if her voice would work if she tried. But the memories that had stolen her speech were still too raw, too vivid. Silence was safer. The road out of town was quiet, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the dusty path. Nora adjusted her parcels and quickened her pace. Being alone outside of town always made her nervous, though she'd never admit it. Independence came with its price. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her tense. Riders coming up behind her usually meant trouble. She stepped to the side of the road, head down, hoping whoever it was would pass without incident. "Miss Campbell." She recognized the voice immediately. Preston James. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, though she didn't turn. "Thought you might want some company on the road. Those outlaws could still be around." His voice was gentle, unpressuring. "I'm headed to my ranch anyway. Your place is on the way." Nora glanced up at him, taking in his tall frame atop the chestnut gelding. She gave a small nod, the closest thing to acceptance she could offer. Preston didn't push for conversation as they traveled. He seemed content to ride alongside her, occasionally commenting on the weather or mentioning something about his ranch. He never expected responses, which made his company strangely comfortable. When they reached the fork in the road that led to her cabin, Nora paused, looking up at him uncertainly. "I'll see you safely to your door, if that's all right," Preston said. "Those outlaws had me worried." She hesitated, then nodded again. No man had been to her cabin before, but something about Preston made her feel secure rather than threatened. Perhaps it was the respectful distance he always maintained, or the way his eyes never lingered inappropriately. Her cabin came into view small but well-maintained, with a tiny vegetable garden to one side and a chicken coop to the other. Preston dismounted but stayed with his horse as she walked to her door. "Nice place," he said appreciatively. "You've done well with it." Nora turned, meeting his eyes for perhaps the first time since they'd met. She inclined her head slightly in thanks. "I'll be heading into town on Thursday," Preston said, swinging back onto his horse. "If you need anything brought back, I'm happy to help." She stood watching as he rode away, a curious feeling stirring in her chest. For the first time in 3 years, she found herself wishing she could call out a simple thank you. The words formed in her mind, but remained trapped, prisoners of a past she couldn't escape. Inside her cabin, Nora put away her supplies with practiced efficiency. The small space was neat and orderly, everything in its place. Control over her surroundings was one of the few comforts she allowed herself. The walls were bare except for a small framed photograph on the bedside table, the only remnant of her life before. She picked it up, tracing the image of the smiling young woman standing beside her parents. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone who had existed in another lifetime. Sometimes Nora wondered if she would ever find her way back to being that person, someone who laughed easily and spoke her mind without fear. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Nora tended her chickens and garden before heading to the creek that ran behind her property. The water was her favorite place to think, the gentle sound soothing her troubled mind. She sat on a flat rock, watching the current flow over smooth stones, and allowed herself to think about Preston James. He'd been in Redemption Creek almost as long as she had, arriving just a few months after her. Unlike most of the men in these parts, he never drank to excess or participated in the rowdier aspects of frontier life. He worked his land, treated people fairly, and kept mostly to himself. In some ways, they were similar, both preferring solitude to the chaos of town life. Perhaps that's why he seemed to understand her need for silence without taking it personally. A twig snapped behind her, and Nora whirled around, instantly alert. Relief flooded through her when she saw it was only a deer, pausing cautiously before continuing to the water's edge. She watched it drink, envying its natural wariness. The creature looked up suddenly, ears twitching, before bounding away into the forest. Moments later, she heard the reason for its flight: hoofbeats approaching along the creek. Nora slid from her rock, preparing to retreat to the safety of her cabin, when she recognized the rider. Preston pulled his horse to a stop when he saw her. "Miss Campbell," he said, genuine surprise in his voice. "I'm sorry to disturb you. I was just checking my property line. Creek makes a natural boundary." She remained where she was, giving a small nod to acknowledge his explanation. "Beautiful spot," he commented, looking around at the sun-dappled creek. "I come here sometimes myself, just to think." Nora found herself curious about what thoughts might occupy the mind of a man like Preston James. She tilted her head slightly, a questioning look in her eyes. Preston seemed to understand. He smiled, the expression warming his weathered features. "Mostly thinking about improvements for the ranch. Been saving to build a proper house. Living in that one-room cabin's getting old." He paused. "And sometimes I think about the folks I left behind in Missouri. Parents passed on, but I've got 2 sisters back there. Write to them when I can." The mention of family made Nora's chest tighten. She looked away, focusing on the flowing water instead. "I should let you be," Preston said after a moment. "Didn't mean to intrude on your morning." He tipped his hat respectfully. "Good day, Miss Campbell." As he turned his horse to leave, Nora found herself reaching for the small slate and chalk she always carried. Before she could reconsider, she quickly wrote something and held it up. Preston stopped, surprise evident in his expression as he read her message. "The creek is lovely in the evening, too." A slow smile spread across his face, but he was careful not to make too much of this small opening. "I imagine it is," he replied. "Perhaps I'll see you here again sometime." He rode away, leaving Nora standing by the creek, her heart beating faster than usual. It was the first personal communication she'd initiated with anyone in Redemption Creek. Small as it was, it felt monumental, terrifying, and liberating at once. For the rest of the day, Nora alternated between regretting her impulsive action and wondering what had prompted it. There was something about Preston that made her feel less broken, less defined by her silence. He seemed to see beyond it, treating her not as an oddity or someone to be fixed, but as a person worthy of respect. That evening, despite her better judgment, she found herself drawn back to the creek. She told herself she was just enjoying the sunset, the way the fading light turned the water to liquid gold. But a part of her acknowledged the hope that Preston might return. He didn't appear, and Nora tried to ignore her disappointment as she walked back to her cabin in the gathering dusk. It was foolish to expect him to interpret her note as an invitation. Better this way, she told herself. Opening up only led to vulnerability, and vulnerability led to pain. The next few days passed in their usual quiet routine. Nora tended her garden, gathered eggs, and made her weekly trip into town for supplies. At the mercantile, she handed Hank her list as always, avoiding the curious gazes of other customers. Afternoon, Miss Campbell, came a familiar voice as she waited for her order. Nora turned to find Preston standing nearby, his arms full of supplies. She nodded in greeting, her eyes dropping to her hands. "Beautiful day," he commented. "Thinking of adding some fencing on the north side of my property. Hank here's helping me with the supplies." He spoke casually, not expecting responses, just sharing his day as one might with any acquaintance. Hank returned with Nora's items. "That'll be $1.15, Miss Campbell." She counted out the money carefully, aware of Preston still standing nearby. As she gathered her purchases, she felt him step closer. "Allow me," he said, reaching for the heavier sacks of flour and sugar. "I'm headed back that way myself." Nora hesitated, then nodded her acceptance. They walked out together, drawing curious glances from townspeople unaccustomed to seeing the silent widow in anyone's company. Outside, Preston loaded her supplies onto his wagon alongside his own. "Hope you don't mind sharing the ride," he said. "Old Buck here can handle the load." The journey back was similar to their previous one, Preston occasionally commenting on something they passed, never pressing for responses. But this time, Nora found herself reaching for her slate once or twice, writing brief replies to his observations. "Creeks running high with the spring melt," he noted as they crossed the small bridge. "Good for the garden," she wrote in response. Preston smiled at that. "You've got quite the green thumb from what I've seen. Those tomatoes by your fence look promising." When they reached her cabin, Preston helped unload her supplies, carrying them to her porch with careful respect for her boundaries. He never attempted to enter her home or linger longer than necessary. "Thank you," Nora wrote before he left. "My pleasure, Miss Campbell," he replied, tipping his hat. "See you around." As spring bloomed into summer, a careful routine developed. Preston would often happen by when Nora was working in her garden or sitting by the creek. Their encounters remained brief, but Nora gradually began to rely on her slate more, sharing small observations about the weather or asking simple questions about his ranch. One hot July afternoon, Nora was struggling to repair her chicken coop when the sound of hoofbeats announced Preston's arrival. He took in the situation at a glance. Several boards had come loose in the recent thunderstorm, and she was having difficulty holding them in place while hammering. "Need a hand?" he asked, dismounting. Nora hesitated, then nodded, handing him the hammer. She held the boards while he secured them, working together in comfortable silence until the job was complete. "Should hold now," Preston said, stepping back to examine their work. "Though this corner post might need replacing soon. Gets a lot of weather." Nora picked up her slate. "Would you like some water? It's hot today." It was the first time she'd ever invited him to stay, even briefly. Preston seemed to understand the significance. "That would be mighty kind, thank you." She brought out 2 cups and a pitcher of cool well water, setting them on the small table outside her door. They sat in the shade, the summer heat making the cold water especially welcome. "Been meaning to ask," Preston said after a while, "if you might be interested in some fresh beef. Butchering a steer next week, and it's always more than I can use." Nora considered this. Meat was expensive, and she rarely indulged in more than an occasional chicken from her flock. She wrote, "I could trade vegetables." "That would be fair," Preston agreed. "Though I was thinking more of bringing you dinner. Thought I might cook up some of it proper. Bring it over." He looked slightly embarrassed. "I make a decent stew." Nora stared at him, surprised by the offer. It sounded remarkably like a social call, something she'd avoided for years. Yet the thought didn't terrify her as it once might have. "Only if you're comfortable with the idea," Preston added quickly. "No pressure." After a long moment, she wrote, "Sunday?" His smile was worth the anxiety the invitation caused her. Sunday would be perfect. Around noon. She nodded, already wondering if she'd made a mistake. But as Preston rode away, looking happier than she'd ever seen him, Nora couldn't bring herself to regret the decision. Sunday arrived clear and warm. Nora spent the morning in a state of nervous anticipation, cleaning her already spotless cabin and changing her dress twice. She hadn't entertained a visitor since before. The thought made her hands tremble, memories threatening to overwhelm her. She forced herself to breathe deeply, reminding herself that Preston wasn't like other men. He had never pushed or demanded. If she changed her mind, he would understand. The knowledge steadied her. He arrived precisely at noon, his horse pulling a small cart loaded with a covered pot and what appeared to be a loaf of bread. He'd clearly made an effort with his appearance, his usual work clothes replaced by a clean shirt and his hair neatly combed beneath his hat. "Afternoon, Miss Campbell," he said, smiling as he lifted the pot. "Hope you're hungry." Nora nodded, gesturing to the table she'd set up outside. She wasn't ready to have him inside her cabin, and he seemed to understand without her needing to explain. "Perfect spot," he said, setting down his offerings. Nothing like eating outdoors on a fine day like this. The stew was delicious tender beef with carrots, potatoes, and herbs that filled the air with a mouth-watering aroma. Nora wrote her compliments on her slate, making Preston duck his head modestly. "My mother's recipe," he explained. "Only thing I learned to cook properly before heading west." They ate in companionable silence, broken occasionally by Preston's observations about his ranch or questions about her garden, which she answered on her slate. It was the longest they'd ever spent in each other's company, yet it felt surprisingly natural. After the meal, Preston hesitated before reaching into his pocket. "Brought something else," he said, pulling out a small book. "Noticed you didn't have many books when I helped with the coop. Thought you might enjoy this one." Nora accepted the gift with careful hands. It was a collection of poetry by Emily Dickinson, published just a few years earlier. She looked up at him, genuine surprise in her eyes. "Picked it up last time I was in Denver," Preston explained. The shopkeeper said it was popular with ladies who appreciate fine writing. Nora traced the cover with her fingertips, deeply touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. She wrote, "Thank you. I love poetry." "Glad to hear it," Preston replied, looking pleased. "Wasn't sure if it would be to your taste." She opened the book, flipping through pages of verse, stopping occasionally to read a line or two. Preston watched her, a soft expression on his face. "There's one on page 43 I particularly like," he said, "about hope being a thing with feathers." Nora turned to the page and read the poem, her eyes widening slightly. She looked up at him, a question in her gaze. "Reminds me of you, somehow," Preston admitted. The quiet strength of it. No one had ever described her as strong before. Broken, yes. Damaged, certainly. But never strong. Nora felt something shift inside her, a small crack appearing in the walls she'd built so carefully. She wrote, "Would you read it aloud?" Preston looked surprised, but pleased. He took the book carefully and cleared his throat before reading. "Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all." His voice was rich and clear, giving weight to each word. Nora closed her eyes, letting the poetry wash over her. It had been so long since she'd heard someone read aloud, longer still since words had moved her so deeply. When he finished, she opened her eyes to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. For a brief, startling moment, she wished she could thank him properly, with her voice rather than her slate. The thought frightened her enough that she stood abruptly, gathering the dishes to signal an end to their meal. Preston took the hint, rising to help her clear the table. "Thank you for allowing me to share your Sunday," he said as he prepared to leave. "It's been the most pleasant afternoon I've had in a long while." Nora nodded, unable to meet his eyes. The afternoon had stirred emotions she'd thought long buried, leaving her feeling raw and vulnerable. "May I call again sometime?" Preston asked, his voice careful, giving her every opportunity to refuse. After a long moment, Nora wrote, "Yes." The simple words seemed to brighten his entire countenance. "Until then, Miss Campbell," he said, tipping his hat before loading his empty pot into the cart. Nora watched him drive away, clutching the book of poetry to her chest. Inside her cabin, she sat by the window and read until the light faded, finding comfort and challenge in equal measure within the pages. The poem Preston had chosen seemed to speak directly to her soul, asking questions she'd avoided for years. Was there still hope perched within her? Could she find her voice again, not just for Preston, but for herself? The questions followed her into sleep, where for the first time in years, her dreams weren't filled with terror, but with poetry, sunlight, and the patient eyes of a cowboy who seemed content to wait for words she wasn't sure would ever come. The following weeks brought more visits from Preston, each one carefully timed to respect her need for solitude, while gradually building something that, had Nora been brave enough to name it, might have been called friendship. He brought small gifts, fresh honey from a neighbor's hives, a handkerchief he'd noticed her admiring in the mercantile window, wildflowers he'd gathered on his ride over. Each offering was presented without expectation, yet each threaded another connection between them. Nora found herself looking forward to his visits, planning what she might write on her slate to make him smile, or what she could offer from her garden in return for his kindness. August brought scorching heat that dried the creek to a trickle and threatened crops throughout the territory. Nora worked from dawn until dusk, hauling water to her struggling garden. The physical labor was exhausting, but it was the fear of losing her food supply that truly worried her. Self-sufficiency was her protection. Dependence on others had only ever brought pain. One particularly brutal afternoon, as she hauled yet another bucket from her well, Preston rode up looking concerned. "You'll work yourself sick in this heat," he said, dismounting quickly to take the heavy bucket from her hands. "Let me help." Too tired to protest, Nora allowed him to take over the watering while she sat in the shade, drinking from the canteen he'd insisted she use. They worked together until dusk, saving what they could of her garden. As they finished, Preston surveyed the wilting plants with a troubled expression. "This drought could last weeks yet," he said. "Your well might not keep up." Nora knew he was right. Already the water level was dropping dangerously low. "I've got a proposition," Preston said carefully. "My property has a spring that's still running strong. Plenty for both of us. If you'd allow it, I could bring water over every few days. Help keep your garden alive until the rains come." The offer was generous, but Nora hesitated. Accepting meant acknowledging she couldn't manage alone, a concession that went against everything she'd built for herself these past years. Preston seemed to read her thoughts. "Neighbors help each other out here. It's how we all survive." He paused. "I'd accept your help just as readily if our situations were reversed." Put that way, it seemed less like charity and more like the practicality frontier life demanded. Slowly, Nora nodded her agreement. "Good," Preston said, looking relieved. "I'll be by tomorrow with the water barrels." True to his word, Preston arrived the next morning with 2 large barrels in his wagon. He positioned them near her garden for easy access, then showed her how he'd modified the lids to prevent evaporation while still allowing her to dip out what she needed. "Should last 3 days or so," he explained. "I'll come refill them before they run dry." Nora wrote, "You're very kind." Preston shook his head. "Just being a good neighbor." But they both knew it was more than that. The careful dance they'd been engaged in for months was slowly changing rhythm, drawing them closer with each encounter. September brought the blessed relief of rain, gentle, soaking showers that greened the parched land and filled the creek once more. Nora's garden revived, promising a harvest that would see her through the winter. Preston continued his visits, though the pretext of bringing water was no longer necessary. One crisp autumn day, as they sat outside her cabin drinking coffee, Preston broached a subject they'd both been avoiding. "Town's planning a harvest festival," he said, watching her reaction carefully. 2 weeks from Saturday. There'll be food, music, dancing." He hesitated. "I was wondering if you might consider attending." "With me?" Nora froze, cup halfway to her lips. A social gathering in town was far different from their private meetings. People would stare, whisper, ask questions she couldn't answer. "We wouldn't have to stay long," Preston added quickly. "Just thought it might be nice to hear the music, maybe have a proper meal for a change." She set down her cup, mind racing. Part of her wanted to refuse outright, to retreat to the safety of her solitude. But another part, a part that had been growing stronger with each of Preston's visits, was tired of hiding, tired of letting fear dictate her every choice. After a long moment, she reached for her slate. "I'll think about it." Preston smiled, clearly having expected an immediate refusal. "That's all I ask," he said. "No pressure either way." He left soon after, giving her space to consider his invitation. Nora spent the evening pacing her small cabin, anxiety and longing warring within her. The thought of being among so many people made her palms sweat and her heart race. Yet the thought of experiencing music again, of seeing Preston in a different context, held undeniable appeal. By morning, she'd made her decision. When Preston came by later that week, She handed him a note. "I will go, but only for a short time." His face lit up with such genuine pleasure that Nora couldn't regret her choice, despite the fear still coiled in her stomach. "You won't regret it," he promised. "And we'll leave whenever you want, no questions asked." As the day of the festival approached, Nora's anxiety grew. She hadn't been to a public gathering since arriving in Redemption Creek. Her limited interactions in town had been carefully controlled, brief exchanges that required minimal engagement. This would be different, unpredictable, exposing. The night before the festival, she seriously considered sending Preston a note canceling their plans. But something stopped her, perhaps the memory of his smile when she'd agreed, or perhaps a growing weariness with her own isolation. The morning of the festival dawned clear and cool, perfect autumn weather. Nora dressed with care in her best dress, a simple navy blue cotton that she'd rarely had occasion to wear. She pinned her hair up, studying her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand. The face that looked back at her seemed both familiar and strange, like a portrait of someone she used to know. Preston arrived precisely when promised, his wagon freshly cleaned and a blanket laid across the wooden seat for comfort. He dressed up as well, wearing a crisp white shirt and a vest she hadn't seen before. When he helped her up to the seat, his hand was warm and steady against hers. "You look lovely," he said, his voice sincere. "That color suits you." Nora felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. She nodded her thanks, clutching her slate and chalk in nervous hands. The ride to town was quiet, Preston seeming to understand her need to prepare mentally for what lay ahead. As they approached Redemption Creek, the sounds of the festival reached them: music, laughter, the hum of many voices blending together. "Remember," Preston said as they neared the town square, "we can leave any time you want. Just give me a sign." Nora nodded gratefully, drawing a deep breath as the wagon rolled into town. The square had been transformed with colorful bunting and tables laden with food. A small band played on a makeshift platform, while children ran laughing between groups of adults engaged in conversation. Preston helped her down from the wagon, offering his arm in a gesture that was protective rather than presumptuous. Nora hesitated only briefly before placing her hand on his sleeve, drawing comfort from his solid presence beside her. Their arrival drew curious glances. The silent widow and the solitary rancher, an unexpected pair at such a festive occasion. Nora kept her eyes down, fighting the urge to flee as they made their way through the crowd. "Preston, didn't expect to see you here," called Hank from the mercantile, approaching with a friendly smile. "Miss Campbell, good to see you as well." Preston greeted the merchant warmly while Nora managed a polite nod. More people approached, each greeting them with varying degrees of surprise and curiosity. Preston handled each interaction smoothly, never putting Nora in a position where her silence would be awkward. "Let's get some food," he suggested after they'd navigated the initial greetings. Mrs. Peterson's apple pie is worth facing this crowd. They filled plates with fried chicken, cornbread, and fresh vegetables from the communal tables. Preston found them a relatively quiet spot at the edge of the gathering, where they could eat while watching the festivities without being at the center of attention. The food was delicious, and the music's simple folk tunes played on fiddle and guitar brought back memories of happier times from Nora's past. She found herself relaxing slightly, the initial terror of being in public gradually easing to manageable anxiety. After they'd eaten, Preston asked, "Would you like to walk around a bit? There's some crafts being shown near the church." Nora nodded, and they spent the next hour examining handmade quilts, carved wooden toys, and preserved foods that community members had brought to display. Preston maintained a steady, calming presence beside her, his occasional comments requiring no response, but keeping her grounded in the present rather than lost in her fearful thoughts. As the afternoon progressed, the band began playing livelier tunes, and couples moved to the cleared area in front of the platform to dance. Preston and Nora watched from a distance, the energy of the dancers bringing a festive atmosphere that was hard to resist. "They're playing a waltz next," Preston said after a while. He hesitated, then asked quietly, "Would you care to dance, Miss Campbell?" Nora stared at him, momentarily panicked at the thought of being so visible, so vulnerable in front of the entire town. Yet the music called to something long dormant within her, a memory of joy she'd almost forgotten. Before she could change her mind, she wrote on her slate, Just one dance. Preston's smile was worth the risk. He led her carefully to the edge of the dancing area, positioning them where they wouldn't be surrounded by other couples. As the waltz began, he placed a respectful hand at her waist, holding her other hand gently in his. "Just follow my lead," he murmured. "I promise not to step on your toes." The first few moments were awkward, Nora stiff with anxiety. But Preston moved with surprising grace for a man who spent his days on horseback, guiding her gently through the steps. Gradually, she relaxed into the rhythm, allowing muscle memory from years ago to take over. They moved together across the packed earth, the music wrapping around them like a protective cocoon. For those few minutes, Nora forgot to be afraid. She forgot that she was the silent widow, the town curiosity. She was simply a woman dancing with a man who looked at her as if she were the most precious thing he'd ever held. When the music ended, Nora became aware of people watching them, some with open curiosity, others with approving smiles. The attention brought her crashing back to reality, her anxiety returning full force. Preston seemed to sense the change immediately. "Ready to go?" he asked quietly. She nodded, grateful for his perception. They made their farewells quickly, Preston handling the social niceties while Nora stood silently beside him. Within minutes, they were back in his wagon, heading away from the noise and crowds. Instead of taking the road toward her cabin, however, Preston turned the wagon toward the creek. "Thought you might like a moment of quiet before heading home," he explained. "The festival can be overwhelming even for those of us who talk too much." The self-deprecating joke brought a small smile to Nora's lips. She nodded her agreement, relief washing through her as they approached the peaceful creek. Preston stopped the wagon in a pretty spot where the water widened, creating a small pool before continuing its journey downstream. They sat in companionable silence, listening to the gentle sound of flowing water and distant birdsong. The tension gradually left Nora's shoulders as the peace of the natural setting worked its magic. "Thank you for coming today," Preston said finally. "I know it wasn't easy for you." Nora reached for her slate. "I enjoyed it more than I expected." "I'm glad." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "You danced beautifully." She felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. Dancing with Preston had awakened something inside her, a yearning for connection she'd denied for too long. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. "Miss Campbell, Nora," Preston said, his voice gentle but serious. "I hope you know how much I've come to care for you over these past months." Nora froze, her heart suddenly pounding. This was the moment she'd both longed for and dreaded, the crossing of a line from friendship into something deeper, something that required more than she might be able to give. "I don't expect anything," Preston continued, reading her expression. "I just wanted you to know that you've become very important to me. Your silence doesn't change that." His sincerity was unmistakable, his eyes holding hers with a warmth that made her breath catch. Nora's hands trembled as she wrote, "I care for you too." The admission felt monumentally significant, as if she'd given voice to something that had been growing within her for months. Preston's smile in response was soft, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "That's enough for me," he said simply. "Everything else can wait." As they rode back to her cabin in the gathering dusk, Nora felt something shift inside her, a loosening of the tight bands that had constricted her heart for so long. Preston James had somehow found a way past her defenses, not by breaking them down, but by patiently waiting for her to open a door. That night, as she prepared for bed, Nora found herself standing before her small mirror, looking at her reflection with new eyes. For the first time in years, she opened her mouth and tried to form a word, the simplest, most important one. "P. Preston," she whispered, her voice raspy from disuse, barely audible even in the silence of her cabin. The sound startled her, foreign yet familiar, like finding an old possession long thought lost. She didn't try again. The effort had exhausted her emotionally, bringing tears to her eyes that she couldn't fully explain. But something had changed. A seed had been planted, one that might, with careful tending, grow into something beautiful. The weeks following the festival brought a subtle change to Preston and Nora's relationship. Though nothing was openly declared between them, there was a new understanding, a deeper connection that manifested in small ways, lingering glances, his hand occasionally covering hers, the way she now welcomed his visits with visible pleasure rather than guarded acceptance. As October painted the countryside in golds and crimsons, Preston began helping Nora prepare her garden and cabin for the approaching winter. He repaired her roof, chopped firewood that he stacked neatly beside her door, and helped harvest the last of her vegetables. First snow could come any day now, he said one evening as they sat by the fire he'd built in her small hearth. It was the first time she'd invited him inside her cabin, a threshold crossed that signified her growing trust. Colorado winters don't mess around. Nora nodded, writing, "My first winter here was difficult. I wasn't prepared. I remember," Preston said. "Saw the smoke from your chimney during that big storm. Worried about you, but didn't think you'd welcome a stranger checking in." "I wouldn't have," she admitted on her slate. "I was different then." Preston studied her face in the firelight. "We all change," he said quietly. "Sometimes for the better." The intimacy of the moment hung between them, delicate as a spider's web. Nora found herself wishing, not for the first time, that she could express herself more fully than her slate allowed. There were things she wanted to tell Preston about her past, about her feelings for him, about the words she'd been practicing in secret when alone in her cabin. But the moment passed, and Preston rose to leave before the darkness made the ride to his ranch too treacherous. At the door, he paused, looking down at her with an expression that made her heart beat faster. "I was thinking," he said, his usual confidence momentarily faltering. "With winter coming on, the roads might get bad. Might be harder for me to check on you regularly." Nora nodded, understanding his concern. The isolation that usually brought her comfort could become dangerous during Colorado's harsh winters. "I have a proposal," Preston continued. "My sister Emma is coming from Missouri next week. She's had some troubles of her own back east. Needs a fresh start." He hesitated. "I was wondering if you might consider letting her stay with you through the winter." The request took Nora by surprise. Another person in her small cabin, in her carefully ordered life? The thought was immediately frightening. Preston seemed to read her reaction. "I know it's asking a lot," he said quickly. "Emma's quiet, keeps to herself mostly, and she's handy with sewing. Cooking could help around the place. You wouldn't have to. Talk to her." The last part was said with gentle understanding. Preston had never pressed her about her silence, never demanded explanations. It was one of the many reasons she'd come to care for him so deeply. "Think about it," he said when she didn't immediately respond. "No pressure. She can stay at my place if need be, though it's not ideal for a lady." After he'd gone, Nora sat by the fire for a long time, considering his request. The thought of sharing her space was daunting, yet the idea of helping someone else, someone who might understand what it meant to be running from something, held a certain appeal. And if she were honest with herself, the prospect of a connection to Preston's family, of being trusted with his sister's well-being, meant more than she could express on her small slate. The next morning, she wrote a note and left it pinned to her door where Preston would see it when he came by. "Your sister is welcome here." Emma James arrived the following week, a slender young woman with Preston's warm brown eyes and a quietness that seemed born of experience rather than nature. Preston made the introductions, his relief at Nora's acceptance evident in his smile. "Miss Campbell has kindly offered to share her home for the winter," he explained to Emma. "She doesn't speak, but communicates through writing." Emma nodded, meeting Nora's eyes directly. "Thank you for your hospitality," she said, her voice soft but steady. "My brother speaks very highly of you." Nora wrote, "Please call me Nora. Welcome to my home." The first few days of their arrangement were awkward, both women carefully navigating the shared space with cautious politeness. But gradually, a rhythm developed. Emma was as quiet as Preston had promised, respectful of Nora's routines and privacy. She proved skilled at cooking and mending, contributing to the household in ways that eased rather than complicated Nora's life. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Emma reading aloud from one of the books Preston had brought over, Nora listening while working on mending or other small tasks. There was a comfort in the arrangement that surprised Nora. The presence of another person didn't feel like the intrusion she'd feared. Preston visited regularly, bringing supplies and news from town. The dynamics between the three of them were easy, comfortable in a way Nora hadn't experienced since before the incident that had stolen her voice. Sometimes, watching Preston and Emma talk, Seeing the obvious affection between brother and sister, Nora felt a bittersweet longing for the family connections she'd lost. As November deepened toward December, Emma gradually began sharing pieces of her story. She had been married briefly to a man in St. Louis who had turned violent after their wedding. Preston had brought her west after helping her escape the situation. "Some nights I still wake up afraid," Emma confessed one evening as they sat by the fire. "Thinking he's found me." Nora reached for her slate, writing words she never thought she'd share with anyone. "I understand fear. It stole my voice." Emma's eyes widened slightly at the confession. "Preston never said what happened to you." "He doesn't know," Nora wrote. "No one does. Sometimes keeping secrets feels safer," Emma said. "But I found that sharing the burden, even a little, can help." That night, after Emma had gone to bed, Nora sat alone by the dying fire, considering the younger woman's words. For 3 years, she had carried her trauma alone, allowing it to isolate her completely. The weight of it had become so familiar, she hardly noticed it anymore, like a stone she'd been carrying for so long that her muscles had adapted to the burden. But recently, with Preston's patient presence and now Emma's quiet understanding, the stone seemed heavier, more noticeable. Perhaps because, for the first time, she could imagine setting it down. The first major snowstorm of the season hit in early December, blanketing the countryside in white and making travel difficult. Preston arrived the morning after the storm, his horse struggling through drifts, his concern for the women evident in his expression. "Roads are nearly impassable," he reported, stomping snow from his boots at the door. "Might be days before they clear. Brought extra supplies just in case." Emma took the bags of flour and coffee, moving to the kitchen area to put them away while Preston warmed himself by the fire. Nora noticed how his eyes followed her around the cabin, taking in signs of her well-being with barely concealed worry. "You look well," he said finally. "Feared you might have had trouble with the chimney again." Nora wrote, "Emma fixed it last week. No smoke problems now." "Good," Preston said, relief evident in his voice. "Wouldn't want to think of you too cold in this weather." They spent the day together, the storm outside making the cabin's warmth even more welcoming. Preston helped with small repairs while Emma cooked a hearty stew and Nora worked on a quilt she'd started for the coming winter nights. As evening approached, Preston reluctantly prepared to leave. "Need to get back before dark," he explained. "But I don't like leaving you with the weather so uncertain." "We'll be fine," Emma assured him. "Nora's teaching me to quilt, and we have plenty of food." Preston still looked troubled. "If the snow keeps up, I might not be able to get through for a few days." "Then we'll see you when we see you," his sister said practically. "Stop worrying, Preston." After he'd gone, Emma turned to Nora with a knowing smile. "My brother cares for you very much," she said. "More than I've ever seen him care for anyone." Nora felt her cheeks warm. She wrote, "He's a good man." "The best," Emma agreed. "And patient. Most men wouldn't understand." She gestured vaguely, indicating Nora's silence. That night, as the wind howled outside and snow continued to fall, Nora lay awake thinking about Preston, his gentle patience, his unwavering respect, the way he looked at her, as if her silence were simply another aspect of who she was rather than a broken piece that needed fixing. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a different future than the solitary one she'd resigned herself to. A future that included Preston, perhaps even a life shared. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. The storm continued for 3 days, keeping Preston away as he'd feared. When he finally made it through on the 4th day, the relief on his face at finding them safe and warm was palpable. "Thought about you both constantly," he admitted as he accepted the hot coffee Emma offered. "Kept imagining the worst. As you can see, we managed just fine," Emma said, though her tone was affectionate rather than scolding. "Nora's been teaching me all sorts of useful things." Preston's eyes found Nora's across the room. "I'm glad," he said simply, but the warmth in his gaze conveyed much more. Later, while Emma was outside feeding the chickens, Preston approached Nora where she sat mending by the fire. "I have something to ask you," he said, his voice carrying an unusual note of nervousness. "Been thinking about it for some time now." Nora set aside her work, giving him her full attention. "Christmas is coming," Preston continued. "I was hoping you and Emma might consider spending it at my place. It's not much, but I've been working on the house, added a proper parlor, second bedroom. He paused. Thought it might be nice to celebrate together. As a family of sorts. The invitation carried significance beyond a simple holiday gathering. It was Preston opening his home, his life, to her in a more permanent way, asking her to consider possibilities beyond their careful friendship. Nora's heart raced at the implications. She reached for her slate, writing carefully, "We would be honored." Preston's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "I'll make sure it's special," he promised. A proper Christmas. After he'd left, Nora found herself standing at the window, watching his figure grow smaller as he rode toward his ranch. Emma came to stand beside her, following her gaze. "You love him, don't you?" she asked softly. The directness of the question startled Nora. She turned to look at the younger woman, seeing only gentle understanding in her expression. After a moment's hesitation, Nora nodded. "Have you told him?" Emma asked. Nora shook her head, gesturing to her throat with a helpless expression. "There are ways to speak without words," Emma said. "I think he already knows, but hearing it or seeing it written would mean the world to him." That night, Nora took out a sheet of proper writing paper, not the slate she used for daily communication, but something more permanent. On it, she began to write the story she had never shared, the one that had stolen her voice and nearly her life. She wrote of her marriage at 19 to Thomas Campbell, a man who had seemed kind and gentle during their courtship, but who had revealed a different nature once they were wed. She described the escalating abuse, first verbal, then physical, and her increasing isolation as he cut her off from family and friends. The words came slowly, painfully, but with each sentence, Nora felt something lifting from her shoulders. She wrote of the final night, when Thomas's rage had been so terrible she believed she would die at his hands. How he had choked her until she lost consciousness, damaging her throat in ways that made speaking painful for months afterward. When she woke, he was gone, taking most of their money and leaving her with bruises that would heal and emotional scars that might never fade. She had fled west, terrified he would find her, changing her name slightly. She had been Nora Campbell before, and choosing silence as her protection. If she didn't speak, she couldn't tell her story to the wrong person, couldn't give herself away if Thomas ever came looking. By the time she finished writing, tears streamed down her face, but they felt cleansing rather than destructive. She folded the pages carefully and placed them in the drawer beside her bed. She wasn't ready to share them yet, not even with Preston, but for the first time, she believed that someday she might be. The days leading up to Christmas were filled with preparation. Nora and Emma baked cookies, sewed small gifts, and decorated the cabin with pine boughs and berries gathered from the surrounding forest. Preston visited regularly, often bringing supplies for their Christmas dinner, and once, mysteriously, a large bundle he refused to explain. "For Christmas," was all he would say, his eyes twinkling with secret pleasure. The morning of Christmas Eve dawned clear and cold, the world outside transformed into a crystalline wonderland by recent snow. Preston arrived early, his wagon prepared for their journey to his ranch. "Ladies," he greeted them, helping each down the steps of the cabin with careful attention. "Ready for a proper Christmas celebration?" The ride to Preston's ranch took nearly an hour, the snow-covered landscape breathtakingly beautiful in the winter sunlight. As they approached, Nora caught her first glimpse of the home Preston had been building. It was larger than she'd expected, a proper two-story farmhouse with a wide porch and smoke curling invitingly from the chimney. "Preston," Emma gasped, "when did you finish the second floor?" "Been working on it whenever I could," he replied, a note of pride in his voice. "Wanted it ready for Christmas." As they drew closer, Nora noticed other details: curtains in the windows, a wreath on the door, even a small stable built off to one side where a milk cow and several horses watched their approach with mild interest. "Welcome to my home," Preston said as he helped them down from the wagon. "Or what I hope might someday be a real home, with the right people to share it." The interior was simple but comfortable, with solid furniture Preston had either made himself or purchased from craftsmen in town. A fire blazed in the hearth, warming the main room where a table had been set for dinner, and a small pine tree stood in the corner, decorated with paper stars and strings of dried berries. "It's beautiful," Emma said, turning to her brother with shining eyes. "You've done all this yourself?" "Had some help with the raising," Preston admitted. But the finishing touches, those were all me. Wanted it to be special. His eyes found Nora's as he spoke, the meaning behind his words clear. This wasn't just a house he was building, but a future he was hoping to share. The day passed in a blur of warmth and celebration. They prepared dinner together, laughing, or in Nora's case, smiling, as Preston proved himself surprisingly capable in the kitchen. They ate by candlelight, sharing stories and creating new memories that felt precious to Nora after years of solitary holidays. After the meal, Preston suggested they open gifts, bringing out packages wrapped in brown paper and tied with red ribbon. For Emma, there was a beautiful leather-bound journal and a silver pen. For your stories, Preston explained. You always had a way with words. For Nora, he brought out a larger package. She unwrapped it carefully to find a writing desk small enough to fit in her cabin, but exquisitely crafted, with drawers for paper and pens, and a surface perfect for writing longer pieces than her slate allowed. I noticed you've been writing more, Preston said, watching her reaction closely. Thought you might like something proper to work on. Nora traced the smooth wood with trembling fingers, deeply moved by the thoughtfulness of the gift. She looked up at Preston, trying to convey with her eyes what she couldn't say with words. There's something else, he said, reaching into his pocket. Something I've been saving for the right moment. He withdrew a small box, holding it out to her with a solemnity that made Emma quietly excuse herself to the kitchen, giving them privacy. Nora Campbell, Preston said, his voice steady despite the emotion visible in his eyes. These past months have been the happiest of my life. I've come to care for you more deeply than I ever thought possible. Nora's heart pounded as she accepted the box, opening it to find a simple gold ring with a small pearl set in the center. I'm not asking for an immediate answer, Preston continued, and I want you to know that I accept you exactly as you are, voice or no voice. But I needed you to know that I love you, and that whenever you're ready, I would be honored to make a life with you. Tears filled Nora's eyes as she looked at the ring, then back at Preston's face. The love she saw there was unmistakable, patient, respectful, and deep enough to accept her brokenness without trying to fix it. She reached for her slate, writing with shaking hands. I love you too. Preston's smile was radiant. That's all I needed to know, he said softly. Everything else can wait until you're ready. Nora shook her head, writing again. I don't want to wait. Yes. Yes. Preston repeated, as if afraid he'd misunderstood. Nora nodded emphatically, her smile breaking through her tears. Preston gently took the ring from the box and slid it onto her finger, his touch reverent. I promise to be patient, he said, to give you all the time and space you need. Our life together will be on your terms, Nora. I only want your happiness. From the kitchen doorway, Emma watched with tears in her eyes, her presence a silent blessing on their engagement. As Preston drew Nora into a gentle embrace, she felt a sense of homecoming not just to this house he'd built, but to the possibility of a future filled with love rather than fear. Later that night, as they sat by the fire after Emma had gone to bed, Nora made a decision. She retrieved her slate, writing carefully. There's something I need to tell you. About why I don't speak. Preston looked at her seriously. Only if you want it, Nora. You don't owe me explanations. I want to, she wrote. But it's a long story. I wrote it down. Understanding dawned in his eyes. Your writing desk. It wasn't just for letters. Nora nodded. Will you come tomorrow? To my cabin. I'll show you. Of course, Preston agreed. Whatever you need. The next morning, Christmas Day, dawned with fresh snow and brilliant sunshine. After a festive breakfast, Preston drove the women back to Nora's cabin, promising to return later for their private conversation. When he arrived that afternoon, Nora was waiting with the pages she'd written, her heart pounding with anxiety, but also with the certainty that it was time to share her truth with the man she loved. They sat together by the fire as Preston read her story, his expression growing increasingly somber. When he finished, he looked up at her with eyes full of sorrow, and something else of fierce protectiveness that made her feel safer than she had in years. Thank you for trusting me with this, he said quietly. I wish I could have protected you from such pain. Nora reached for her slate. You've helped me heal, more than you know. Preston took her hand, his touch gentle. Your silence, it's not just emotional, is it? He hurt your throat. She nodded. It healed physically, she wrote. But speaking became terrifying. as if using my voice might somehow lead him to me. He'll never hurt you again, Preston promised, his voice carrying an edge of steel beneath the gentleness. I'll make sure of it. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of her revelation hanging between them. Finally, Preston spoke again. Nora, I want you to know that this changes nothing about how I feel. Whether you ever speak aloud or not, I love you exactly as you are. The sincerity in his eyes brought fresh tears to hers. She wrote, I've been practicing. When I'm alone. Small words. Preston's expression brightened with careful hope. That's wonderful, if it's something you want for yourself. But please know it's not something I need or expect. Nora set down her slate, gathering her courage. The moment felt right. Christmas Day. The man she loved looking at her with complete acceptance, the safety of her own home surrounding them. She took a deep breath, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and determination. Then, in a voice rusty from disuse but growing stronger with each syllable, she spoke her first sentence in over 3 years. I love you, Preston James. The words hung in the air between them, imperfect but clear. Preston's eyes widened, a look of wonder spreading across his face. Nora, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Your voice is beautiful. She shook her head, smiling through her tears. Needs practice, she managed, the words coming easier now that the first ones had broken through. Preston reached for her hands, holding them as if they were precious beyond measure. We have time, he said softly. All the time you need. The rest of the winter passed in a blur of quiet joy. Nora's voice returned gradually, gaining strength with each passing day as she practiced first with Preston and Emma, then eventually with trusted friends from town. The story of her past spread in careful, controlled ways, bringing understanding rather than the judgment she had feared for so long. By the time spring painted the Colorado landscape with fresh green and wildflowers, Nora was speaking regularly, though she still preferred writing for longer communications. Her engagement to Preston was announced formally at Easter, with a June wedding planned to give them time to prepare. Emma decided to stay in Redemption Creek, taking a position as assistant to the schoolteacher with plans to eventually take over the school herself. She would live in Nora's cabin after the wedding, keeping the place that had sheltered both women during difficult times within their growing family. The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, the kind of early summer day that seemed designed for celebrations. Nora dressed in a simple ivory gown that Emma had helped her sew, wild roses from the creek bank woven into her hair. Preston waited for her at the small church in town, his face lighting up as she walked toward him on the arm of Hank Morrison, who had agreed to give her away. The entire town had turned out for the ceremony, the community that had once seemed so threatening now a circle of support around them. When it came time to speak her vows, Nora's voice was clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the church. I, Nora Campbell, take you, Preston James, to be my husband. The words she had practiced for weeks flowed without hesitation, a testament to how far she had come. Preston's eyes shone with pride and love as he spoke his own vows, promising to cherish and protect her all the days of their lives. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, the kiss they shared was a beginning not just of their marriage, but of a life where silence was a choice rather than a prison. The celebration afterward was joyous, with music and dancing lasting well into the evening. As the sun began to set, Preston led his bride to the waiting wagon that would take them to their home now, the house he had built with her in mind even before he'd known she would share it. Happy, Mrs. James? He asked as he helped her up to the seat. Nora smiled, the expression reaching her eyes in a way it never had during her years of silence. More than I ever thought possible, she replied, her voice soft but no longer fearful. As they drove away from town toward their future, Nora leaned against her husband's shoulder, grateful beyond words for the patient cowboy who had waited for her to find her voice again, not just the physical ability to speak, but the courage to trust, to love, to believe in second chances. The years that followed brought challenges, as all lives do, but also immeasurable joy. Their first child, a daughter, arrived the following spring, bringing a completeness to their family that neither had dared to dream of. When the baby cried her first lusty wail, Nora laughed aloud, the sound ringing through the bedroom like music. She has your voice, Preston said, cradling his newborn daughter with wonder. Strong and beautiful. And your patience, Nora replied, smiling up at her husband. Though I hope she'll never need to wait as long as you did to hear the words I love you. Preston leaned down to kiss her forehead. Some things are worth waiting for, he said simply. Some people even more so. As twilight painted the Colorado sky in shades of purple and gold, the small family stood together on the porch of their home, the baby sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms. Nora looked out at the land that had first offered her refuge and now provided a home, at the man who had loved her through silence and speech, and felt a contentment that once would have seemed impossible. Thank you, she said softly, for waiting until I was ready. Preston's arm tightened around her shoulders. I would have waited forever, he replied, but I'm mighty glad I didn't have to. Their laughter mingled in the evening air, rising toward the emerging stars, the sound of healing complete, of love triumphant, of voices finally free.